Welcome, class, to Understanding the Performance Assessment Project. This project is worth 15% of your grade, and it's due on November 24th. Everything we're discussing can be found, like all assignments, in the Assignments folder in the Performance Assessment Project folder. There you'll find the instructions and the template, the rubric for grading, and the link to submit. Please remember to do all your work on the template itself. Don't open a blank document and start this, or you may miss portions of the assignment. Let's begin with what you need to think about in the instructions. First of all, like the EdTPA assignment, you need to come up with a standard. You may or may not choose to use the same standard that you used in the EdTPA assignment. You need to develop an aligned learning target. Make sure your learning target is aligned with your standard. You probably don't want to use the same learning target that you used in the EdTPA assignment because that was focused towards developing a quiz and assessing for knowledge. This is focused on a performance task. That is, students have to do something, and you're going to develop a rubric to assess that. You may be able to use the same learning target, but you may have to adjust the verbiage a little bit. So for example, if you're teaching high school and you're using a learning target appropriate for high school, instead of saying identify, you might be able to say write or defend or something like that where they have to write an essay. So play around with that, but remember, whatever you do, this has to be a performance task. And you're learning this week about what performance tasks are. Like all learning targets, make sure it has a criterion for success, and it's probably going to be focused on accuracy. So for example, with 80% accuracy. Next, think about the context. Where would you teach this lesson and do this performance task and assess it? So specifically, some things I'm going to be looking for when I grade it are what school, what grade level, how many students are there any gifted students or students with IEPs or 504 plans, what subject, if it's, for example, middle school or high school, what will the students have been taught so far and what might come next. So make sure you just click checking off all those boxes when you're answering this question. Your description of your lesson or what you're going to teach should be aligned with your standard and learning target, but it doesn't have to be quite as detailed as your EdTPA. So describe the lesson or lessons you might teach to cover the learning target. How will you teach them, the students? What would you have students do? And be specific enough. So don't just say, I'll read a text. Well, what text will you read? Might be a good detail to include. Number 5 is the performance task. And remember that a performance task is something students do. They perform in some way. And I don't want you to think about performance as like a musical performance or a artistic performance necessarily. It can also be when students write an essay. It can be when students solve very complex math problems. It's not something that's not easily measured with a multiple choice, true, false, etc. And so you can see some more examples there: writing essays, developing PowerPoints, writing poetry, solving math problems, and more. They must perform. Now here's something that's very important and that students get tripped up on. Your performance task should be sufficiently complex to warrant a rubric, to require a rubric. Not something you can grade by simply marking answers right or wrong. So in past years, I've had students try to give me a math problem that is very, not necessarily simple to solve, but there are not multiple steps and all they're looking for is a right or wrong answer. That's not appropriate. That's not a performance task. But if you're doing a math problem, for example, that has multiple steps and you want to break out and see if students got each step right, and you're assigning points for the right answer and some points for the steps, and there's a lot more complexity to it, it might be appropriate. But think carefully because it's not just, for example, 2 times 3. That's either right or wrong, and there's no way, it would not be appropriate to grade that with a rubric. Next, you're going to develop 2 rubrics to grade or assess the student's work. The first is a teacher rubric. Now, this is, by teacher rubric, I mean the rubric you're going to use to assess the student's work. It can either be holistic or analytic. You should look at your textbook for the justifications of when you would use each, because you're going to have to cite your textbook. Make sure that it's well suited to the task and the grade level. So it should be aligned to your standard and your target and your lesson and your performance task. The criteria and levels of performance should be appropriate and clear. So if you have grading, for example, on a 4-point scale, I should be able to tell distinctly what the difference is between 4 points and 3 points and 3 points and 2 points. I talked about alignment with objectives, and in this case, learning target and standards. Your descriptions of your criteria should be teachable, clear, identifiable, and measurable. So, for example, try to avoid using very subjective words such as most when you can. I know sometimes we have to do that, but as much as possible, use number ranges and use clear and measurable descriptions. Continue between levels of performance are clear and appropriate. So again, what's the difference between a level 1 and 2, etc., and aligned with the task. Now, this is something that you need to pay attention to. You need to put your rubric in a table, in a word table, because that's the only way you're going to get things to line up. I've had students try to submit just using tabs to create their columns, and it doesn't work in Word. So just go ahead and use the insert table command, give however many columns and rows you need, and then go from there. Remember that you should have no fewer than 3 levels, and probably you should have 4 is better. You should have multiple criteria in the rows, so not just 1 or 2, because if you only have 1 or 2 criteria, it's probably not appropriate to grade with a rubric. The second rubric you're going to design is a student rubric, and so this would be kid-friendly. The idea is you would give this rubric to your class and say, this is how I'm grading your assignment. Make sure it's aligned with your teacher rubric. They cover the same criteria, but it should be written in age-appropriate language. So if you're developing a rubric for very young students, instead of having words like developing and inappropriate at the top of the columns, you might use happy faces and smiles and frowny faces, for example. Make sure the language is very, very basic. As a matter of fact, you have to run a Flesch Kincaid reading level on it and enter the grade level there. I don't need the readability analysis for this one, but I do need the grade level. And just like with the EdTPA assignment, it should be plus or minus 1 grade level from your standard. There's a justification required. So in the justification, you need to state whether your rubric is analytic or holistic and why you chose this type of rubric. And you must cite the textbook here for why and when you would choose this type of rubric. You can't just say, I thought it would be fun to create a holistic rubric. And if you don't, that's not full credit on the rubric for this assignment. The last part of the assignment is the reflection. This is where you think back on this experience and think about what went well, write about what did not go well, what surprised you, what did you learn that you can take forward into your classroom. This is different, again, as in previous assignments, from a conclusion. A conclusion is a summary that states, here's what I did. A reflection, though, is more thoughtful. Here's what I did, and here's what I think about it, and here's what I'm going to take away from it. So let's cover the grading rubric for the project. If you look here, you can see the first 4 criteria that I'm going to use to score your work. This is a grading rubric because every cell in the table contains a description. If it were a grading scale, it wouldn't show that description. The first criterion is whether your standard is there and whether it includes your source. So Common Core State Standard, for example, or Next Generation Science Standard. The second criterion is the learning target. If your learning target is missing, you earn 0 points, all the way up to 2 points for the learning target. If it's extremely clear, unmistakably measurable, and specific to the standard, and it has a criterion for success, you earn the full credit. The context section is also worth 2 points. If you're missing a context or it's very incomplete, 0, all the way up to 2 points where it clearly and thoroughly describes the class in which the task is implemented. The description of the lesson is worth 2 points. To earn full credit, it needs to be seamlessly related to the learning target and fully describe what needs to be done to cover the learning target. The performance task is next, and it should align with your learning target and your lesson. The teacher rubric should be very clear. The criteria and levels of performance, so the rows and the columns should be very clear, appropriate to the task and the grade level. So there should be no questions when you're grading students' projects or performance tasks as to what the grade should be, the score should be. I'm going to look at your alignment of your rubric to your task. In other words, if you have a rubric that assesses one thing, but your task asks them to do something else, that won't be full credit. Your student rubric should be clear. The grade level should be appropriate, for example, for the reading of the rubric, and it should align well with the task and with the teacher rubric. So similar kinds of things should be on each rubric. Your justification for the type of rubric should be there, and importantly, you should cite from the course readings or lectures. Your reflection comes next, and this is whether it's present and presents ideas for what was learned from the project. There's a criterion on how well you're spelling, grammar, and professionalism in writing. APA is part of professionalism, by the way. And finally, your rubric presentation, whether it's well aligned and formatted in a table. Now there are 12 criteria here. The most you can earn for each one is 2 points, so that's 24 points. But remember that this assignment doesn't count for 24 points in your course grade. It'll count for 15 points. So I do a little calculation at the end next to total. You can look next to total when you get your score back and see how that calculation is done and what grade will be assigned to your assignment. So we're going to post our draft rubrics only in the discussion board next week for peer feedback. If you have any questions about this assignment, please don't hesitate to email me. Thanks.